We are now live and recording, and I see that we have guests joining us rapidly.
Well, good. How do we know?
If you look at the participants, the number of participants is going to increase at the bottom of the screen.
I see.
And
Thank
I
you.
have all of the functions that you would like me to have to bring people up for questions and put them back in the attendees. So I'm going to turn off my, I'm going to mute myself and turn off my camera, and we can get started.
You want them to put their comments just in the chat. You want them to put their comments in chat.
Yeah,
yes.
and we'll also solicit
questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's my question.
So,
all right.
So we'll just give people a couple more minutes to enter, and let's see. We have 28 participants. Well, shall we start?
Fine with me. Let's go.
Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome this evening to the members of the Columbia community, to my former students, to my current students, to Anya Shifrin and to Jerry Mitchell, and to the many alumni of this course who I understand are out there. So welcome to an open session of narrative journalism across the platforms and borders. I'm Claudia Dreifus. I teach this course, and I also teach another course at the School of Professional Studies on writing about science. One of the great pleasures of this class and of teaching it is that I get to introduce my students to some of the people that I work with, who are editors, who are writers, who are journalists, and journalists are the best people in the world. And Jerry Mitchell is like a prince among journalists because he is someone who has shown us what this field can do to make the world a better place. Tonight, I'm honored to have this giant in journalism, a reporter who used his skills and his determination to solve some of the most traumatic and difficult and painful murders of the 20th century. Civil rights cold cases from the 1950s and 1960s. And this young man came to Mississippi, worked on the Clarion-Ledger, and used what he knew how to do to get those cases solved and prosecuted. He talks about all of this in his book, which he's in the background there, Jerry Mitchell. And just to say that we met last winter when he was on book tour, and I was interviewing him for the New York Review of Books. And we did a really wonderful interview session, and then the virus struck and his book tour ended. It was probably the last thing that either of us did out of the house. So I'm very pleased that he could be here tonight, and he is going to be introduced by the director of our program, Professor Anya Shifrin, who is herself a great expert on the question of journalism and what journalism can do. This is her book, one of many books on muckraking, and it's called Global Muckraking, and it surveys 100 years of breakthrough reporting by brave journalists around the world. But her other books deal with different aspects of muckraking and journalism. So take it away, Anya, and thank you for introducing Jerry.
Well, thank you very much. I read your book this week. It gave me nightmares. I couldn't put it down. Really unbelievably gripping. And I guess I just wanted to say a few things. One is, as a work of journalism, you embody so much of what we teach, that persistence is essential, that asking questions, that digging, that going back to stories and not letting them, lie forgotten is a really essential part of investigative journalism. So you really are in that, global muckraking category that we write and teach about here at CEPA. And that, you're bringing a spotlight and your naming and shaming did have impact. So I thought that was, really interesting, important work journalistically. The other thing I just wanted to say was, how shocking. I think many of our students are younger and they're international, and they may not really know the significance of the murders that you investigated.
Right.
So I really want to underscore for everybody on the call that these were the most high profile killings of the civil rights movement. And I had not realized, we've all learned so much from the Black Lives Matter movement, but I remember all those murders as a child, but I hadn't realized about the impunity in our country and the fact that those killers had not gone to jail. I mean, it was mind-boggling for me. The children killed in the Birmingham church. I mean, these were the most exemplary murders, and that those killers were free.
I walk straight.
I have goosebumps as I'm listening. So I think it's really important, for this generation, as we think about racial justice and the history of racism in this country. And then the third point I want to make is just a personal one, which is, Medgar Evers, these little girls, I mean, so many of these people, but for me, the Upper West Side connection with Andrew Goodman and Schwerner and Cheney. My sister went to the Walden School,
Right.
and Andrew Goodman was one of their students.
Yeah.
And he went down to Mississippi to register voters.
Yes.
And he was killed.
Yes.
And when we were children, we knew all about that story. He was one of us. He was from our neighborhood. And Walden built an auditorium named after him.
Mhm.
And we all went for the dedication and the assembly. So these were really our people. And of course, as I was reading your book, I was also thinking, imagine that could have been one of our SEPA students. So I just want everyone to understand how real this is and how much a part of our lives as well. So I'm going to shut up right now because I'm so eager to, Professor Dreifus, incredibly generous of you to invite these unbelievable guests and to open it up to the whole school. And since you're a star interviewer, I have nothing to add.
Well, why don't we share this interview, because you have lots to add. And as you were talking, Anya, I was thinking that one of the things that Jerry's book resonates to us today on is the involvement of law enforcement in some of these murders, which people didn't really. The impunity was facilitated, would you say, Jerry?
Yes. I mean, you had law enforcement who were Klansmen or Klan sympathizers, and I only wrote about a few cases. I mean, there were many others along it, or let's say they're Klan sympathizers, and therefore they didn't investigate, or it was some of their buddies that did it. And the other thing is there were a lot of auxiliary police, and they Klan recruited. I mean, specifically recruited law enforcement. You see that in the book, and it's just fascinating, what all they did, to try to get their tentacles into law enforcement, to kind of get them to do their bidding, essentially.
Do you see some of that happening now?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's the history of this country. I mean, posses kind of gave way in a way to sheriff's offices that gave, the slave patrols became posses, which became sheriff's offices, and all of those things. You see kind of historical connections with a lot of these things. And yeah.
Well, let's backtrack a little and introduce you. And Anya, please feel free to jump in. And those of you out there in the Zoom Netherlands, send us your questions and we'll throw them in. You can also make notes on the chat function. I'm not quite sure how that works, but I'm told it does.
Put the questions in chat is probably the best place.
Yeah, we'll try to work it in any case. Jerry, you grew up in East Texas.
I did.
Yeah. And I'm told that this idea of journalism came to you when you were interning at a small East Texas newspaper, and somebody gave you a copy of Woodward and Bernstein's book, All the President's Men.
They told me, we talked about it. He asked me what, I was telling you, this guy was like a burned out editor, he used to be the State House reporter in Oklahoma. And he's like, one of those guys that chain smoked Marlboros, and we all, in those days, all of us who are my age or about it, remember when newsrooms were not non-smoking. I mean, all newsrooms were smoking. He didn't
So
have a
that's an
clue.
improvement.
Yeah. Well, I'm just talking about, this is like early 80s.
Yeah.
And so he's chain smoking Marlboros. So what do you think you want to do in journalism? I'm like, I think I'd like to be an investigative reporter. He said, have you read All the President's Men? I said, I've seen the movie. He says, read the book and study how they use attribution. I always say it's like some of the best advice in journalism I ever got. So I studied it, became my little Bible, how to do investigative reporting,
How did they use attribution and how did you use it?
Yeah, well, I copied them. Like, for example, in All the President's Men, like they may go interview some people who testified before the federal grand jury. And rather than saying they told me last night or whatever it was, they would say attribute it to grand jury testimony. That got them in trouble one time with the Sloan testimony. They weren't quite so careful. They needed to double check with him to make sure he told the grand jury that, which turned out that he hadn't told they hadn't asked, and therefore he hadn't told. But that's how you could, that's a way you can use attribution. So in other words, like you have, and that's what I did with the early Sovereignty Commission stuff. I was able to get them confirmed so I could attribute it to the documents as opposed to so-and-so who read me the document. You know what I mean? Like, because that's how it happened. The guy actually read me the documents, read me some of the documents. So I didn't, or the original stuff I actually had verbally. And so, but I had to have a second source, a second independent source to be able to confirm that. And then I felt safe in attributing it to the Sovereignty Commission records.
Let me just rudely interrupt you and
Sure.
and ask you to explain to
I got to explain the Sovereignty
Commission because this is
It's
something
fascinating. It's
people don't know about.
Yeah, you probably don't. It was a state segregationist spy agency in Mississippi that was run by the governor and all the top state leaders. And so it was, basically they spied on people in the civil rights movement. They tried to smear them. They tried to, basically got people run out of the state, fired from their jobs, all that kind of stuff. And really nefarious. But also kind of a joke too. But anyway, they collected all these spy records, more than 132,000 pages of spy records, but they were all sealed by the Mississippi legislature when the agency was officially done away with in 1977. But they sealed them for 50 years. So when I heard that, I thought, there's something in there. And they wouldn't be sealing them for 50 years. So that's when I started working on my sources. I began talking to people that had read the files. And
so you're saying that the state of Mississippi,
but they told me, go ahead.
The state of Mississippi had something like the Stasi.
It's like the Stasi. That's a good comparison. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the students in the current class, Nora Reisenberg, asked a question on the chat, but it sort of dovetails with a question I wanted to ask you. She wants to know how you get people to trust you and talk to you on cold cases. And I know there's quite a story on getting Merle Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, to kind of open up to you, because once that happened, things started happening. How does a white guy from Texas get the trust of Black people in Mississippi?
I don't know. I mean, it was, the families, the fact that they were able to trust me, I have no idea why they trusted me, to be honest with you, because I'm just, like I said, I'm a white Southerner. What have I got to trust? But I think it was just the fact over time, I kept coming back to her with more information, and she realized what I was doing. And I really got to know her and her family both. And so you just begin to build that trust over time. When I found out stuff, I'd call her, you know what I mean? And so you begin to build that kind of trust from that perspective. And so she began to trust me pretty early, to be honest. And then she began to share stuff with me. She actually shared with me first a copy of the court transcript that she'd found in her, that she'd been keeping in a safety deposit box. So she wasn't going to share it with authorities. They pretty much have made clear they weren't going to do anything. And so she shared it with me. And anyway, so those are the kind of things that happened over time. But yeah.
Tell us a little about you getting to Mississippi as a young man and how you got started on all of this. So you get,
Well, I mean, I got to Mississippi simply because the guy who hired me for my first job in journalism hired me. Uh, he was the editor of the Texarkana Gazette, which is where I grew up, and then he became the editor of the Clarion-Ledger. And David Cabissa, who's a New Yorker, so David hired me, and the second time. So that's how so I just started off as a bureau reporter, and then I was a court reporter. And then it was while I was technically a court reporter that I got assigned to go cover this movie called Mississippi Burning. So that's really how the journey all began. And
this is a terrible movie, but one of the things,
it's
a really horrible movie.
Don't see it. Do not see the movie. Okay, now that I've said that, it had a profound effect on me. But the reason was not just the film itself. I knew nothing about any of this. So you have to understand, I knew nothing, zero. And I'm watching this, violence unfold. Hang on 2 seconds. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Anya, we can do this interview together.
Sorry about that.
No, this is great. I'm loving every minute of it. Thank you.
Folks out there, if you'll send us your questions in the chat function, we can pitch them to Jerry.
All right, we're good.
Okay, the man is back.
I see the question he is asking about, or she did, about how do you convince people to talk about a difficult topic? And that's, you want to get people relaxed. And so what I've done a lot of times is actually interview people in their home. If you feel comfortable with that, interview them in their home, they're relaxed there. Another good place is take them out to eat. I've taken Klansmen out to eat, believe it or not, a couple of Klansmen out to eat. You just want to get people relaxed. You want to get them comfortable and get them talking. And in terms of reaching out on the phone, that's a tough one. I mean, I know what we do in the South, but obviously it's not necessarily what you do in New York. You don't talk about what you're calling about. you start talking about other stuff. You call and you go, hey, and the easiest way to get people to talk is to be interested in their life story. And it's not insincere. You want to find that out and everything. So anyway.
So you told me about going to interview Byron D. LeBeckwith, who was the assassin of Medgar Evers, who lay in a bush and waited for him and ambushed him. And he had been tried once, maybe twice, and acquitted for the murder twice.
No, not acquitted.
Not acquitted. Mistrial?
Yeah, mistrial.
Okay. But he was walking free.
Yes, he was.
And you went and interviewed him. And after was he indicted a third time because of you?
Yes, he was indicted.
So you went and you interviewed him. What was that? How'd you get him to talk?
I passed the quiz. He gave me this quiz about, he wanted to know where I grew up, what my parents' names were, where I went to college, where I went to church, where I lived. I mean, he asked me all these questions, and I could have refused to answer, but I knew he'd love my answers. So I just answered honestly, because I had this very, conservative WASP upbringing. And so I knew every answer I gave, he'd be like, oh yeah.
you're one of us.
I'm one of him, so I'm one of the family. So yeah, as I say in the book, I mean, he welcomed me like a long lost cousin or something, it was really kind of fascinating. He thought he found a kindred spirit in me, but obviously no.
Did you learn anything?
Oh yeah.
Like?
A ton. Yeah.
What?
Fascinating. Well, I learned how he became a racist. I felt like he just kind of joined everything. He was an orphan by age 12 and joined everything, and eventually joined the KKK. So,
what I was aiming for earlier was you described to me.
Story of going to interview him. Do you want me to tell that story?
Oh yeah, tell that story.
So I went to interview Byron D. LeBeckwith, as you mentioned. Well, he was absolutely most racist person I ever spent serious time with. It was like N-word this, N-word that. And he just, and then, and they started in all the other non-white races, and incredibly racist. One of those people that you got done interviewing and feel like you need a bath. And so I get done, it's starting to get dark. He lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is outside of Chattanooga. And so
it was like a Klan neighborhood.
Yeah, no, he had like Confederate battle flag flying outside his house, and the Klan used to collect money on the street corner. This was Klan territory. If you've ever heard Dr. King's speech, let freedom, about ring out,
from Lookout Mountain.
Lookout Mountain. That's the mountain that faces Signal Mountain. And there were Klan havens both places. So anyway, we get done, it's getting dark, and he insists on walking me out to the car, and I'm like, really? That's okay. I think I can find my way. So he walks me out to the car anyway. He gets me out there, says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife had made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, on that, Sarah Rose Williams, who's a member of this class, wants to know if you were ever kind of afraid for your life, considering the work you did.
Yeah.
And do.
Well, I think I was young and kind of headstrong, and as a person of faith, I thought in those terms as well. So obviously you do want to be careful. I know with Edgar Ray Killen, the only time he would meet me.
You better identify him.
I will. He was the guy who orchestrated the killings of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner that we've been talking about. In what's called the Mississippi burning case. The FBI is the one that named it that. And, or my burn for short, if you're looking at the file itself. So, but he orchestrated that. So I wanted to talk with him, just like I'd done with all the killers. I wanted to go interview him. My theory the whole time was get to these Klansmen before law enforcement can. Because I knew once it got more serious, they get a lawyer, or especially once they got arrested, they definitely weren't going to talk. So I just wanted to get to them early. That was always my theory. Let me get to them as early as humanly possible. So I did. I called them up because I was working on a story. And I already did the one story, and then I was trying to see if I could get him to talk to me. He talked to me quite a bit on the phone. I was trying to talk to him in person. And so anyway, he agreed to it, but he would only do it in person at his house, like 9 o'clock on Saturday, well after dark. And he lived in this really remote rural place, and I knew where it was. I was like, which was, by the way, just a mile from where the killings took place. So I'm like, I'm not sure I want to go see this guy in his house, that late at night. And so I got him to agree to meet me at a restaurant. And I let him pick the restaurant. I didn't care what restaurant. It was like a catfish place. And one was $8.95 back in those days, $8.95 all you can eat catfish places. So we met him and his wife, and ate and talked, and it was, anyway, he said he didn't have anything to do with it, but then he went on to say that he couldn't say. I said, what do you think should happen to people that did do it? And he said, well, I'm not going to say they were wrong. It was very fascinating. These guys don't make any, they don't hide their racism. He told me this whole story about how he wanted to shake hands with Dr. King's assassin and stuff like that. It's just, again, people will see these guys going off to trial or whatever, and they'll say to me, Jerry, why don't you leave these old guys alone? And I'll tell them, these were young killers. They just happen to get old,
Jerry, didn't Killens threaten your life?
Yeah, he wasn't too happy with me.
So what'd you do? Did you have to have security or?
Well, the scariest thing he did actually was after we got done at the restaurant. He walked toward my car, and I just wasn't. I thought maybe there was something else he wanted to say, or I wasn't even thinking. And he walked past me, and I instantly knew what he was doing. He was memorizing my license plate number. Like, he walked past me to look at my license plate number. And back in those days in Mississippi, if you had somebody's license plate number, you could get their address. It wasn't private at that point. So anyway.
Can we backtrack a little? One of the things that you told me was that when you first got to Mississippi and to the Clarion-Ledger, you found it shocking the way everybody knew who these killers were.
Yeah.
And nobody was doing anything about it.
That was when I was at the movie. That was what I found out. There were these 20 guys that were involved in, this killers.
Killing Andrew Goodman, among others.
Yeah, Andy Goodman and Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney, and nobody ever been prosecuted for murder. I mean, that's the thing I couldn't wrap my head around at that movie after talking to and I was kind of like, why didn't the state prosecute this? I don't understand. Because, I covered courts by this point. I knew how courts worked and knew at least a little bit about the law. So I was like, why didn't they prosecute these cases? So anyway.
Now, Elizabeth Powell, who's in the current class, asked Elizabeth Powell is her name, and she asked a really good question. She asked, quote, "Through your reporting, did you gain any insights into why there was such a moral gap between Southern churchgoers and racism?"
Yeah, well, it's bizarre. It was just very strange. Well, they ended up justifying, as Beckwith did, they ended up actually using the Bible to justify their racism. I mean, and so, or they were just as generations before, the same Southern Christians had used the Bible to defend slavery. You know what I mean? I mean, so it's kind of like people, if they want to go find something that they feel like, supports it, they'll go find it somewhere, it was absolutely absurd what Beckwith said. It was not really, in my mind, even remotely correct. As someone who is a person of faith, I'm horrified by all this. So anyway.
How did you find a church you could join?
Well, I mean, you want to find a church that obviously, I think this is maybe a simplistic way of thinking about it, but I think of it from my particular faith perspective. I want to find a church that actually believes what Jesus says. I mean, maybe that's overly simplistic. Like where it says, "Love your enemies," right? Take care of the least of these. I mean, those are the kind. I mean, that's what he says. So why wouldn't we do that? And why would, and it says, "Don't mistreat the foreigners," because you too were foreigners at one point, and so all these scriptures, I mean, I don't understand people where they get the mentality that they have justification to mistreat people or hurt people or harm people. It's just not in there, in my opinion, but nonetheless, they can always find some scripture somewhere that justifies whatever that, they want to figure out, unfortunately.
Anya, I'm wondering, what does Jerry have in common with these international muckrakers that you have worked with and helped and studied?
Tenacity and bravery. I think that there's, oh, wow, so interesting. There's some great stuff in the chat. Yeah, I think the bravery and the willingness to put yourself in harm's way. I mean, there were so many points in the book when your wife asked you to please stop or please hold back.
Oh,
and and you just kept going.
I know. And there was, I understand it far better now than I did when I was that age.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was also, it was like the movies, there's always in the detective novel, the rogue detective who gets taken off the case. So at one point your editor took you off the story And
Yeah.
then you had to like come back and do an even, bigger story so that they forced you
They
back
had to put me
on.
back on
So
the
it was very
story.
cinematic in many ways.
Yeah, there's a great movie there. And in fact, the biggest case of all, although the murder of the 4 little girls at the
That's-
16th Street Baptist Church, you
Oh.
nailed the guy, or you helped
Well,
nail the
actually,
guy,
there's so many
the guy who set the bomb, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah,
How'd you
Bobby
do that?
Cherry. Bobby Cherry. Well, I went and interviewed him. I mean, that's what I keep telling you. You never know. I mean, you don't even know sometimes during the interview that you've gotten something valuable. And that's why you go do it. I mean, you never know, because so often when people commit murder, they're not necessarily they're not necessarily careful, you know what I mean, about their language, especially over time. They feel like they've gotten away with it. This guy didn't feel like he'd ever be prosecuted. And so Bobby Cherry, and he just, let me come chat. In fact, his wife actually, this is a bizarre part, which is in the book. His wife actually emailed me. I'd already talked to the guy by phone once. And his wife emailed me and said, Bobby wants to talk to you. And I'm like, okay. And so he lived near Tyler, Texas, which is not far from where I grew up, which is the schizophrenic town of Texarkana. And so drove over and met him and his wife, took him out for barbecue, and which is what I guess you take Klansmen out for. I'm not sure. But anyway, we had barbecue and we ate and we talked. And he's like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. And he pulled out this sworn statement to this woman. I remember that now, where we're all sitting around watching wrestling. So anyway, I got back to the newsroom, and this is just like the most basic rule in journalism. I'm sure you already know it, but this is the way we say it in the South. Even if your mama tells you she loves you, check it out. Mm-hmm. And so that's what you always do. And I had no idea. I just turned to our librarian, Susan Garcia, and said, Susan, because I remember from my childhood, they used to run the entire television schedules in a very small box in the newspaper, because there were only like 2 or 3 channels. So that's what I told Susan. I said, just check with the Birmingham News, it was on TV that night. Next day, Susan comes back to me and says, there was no wrestling. So this guy's whole alibi was based on a TV program that didn't even air. So, and of course I called him back. That's the other thing you always have to do as a reporter. You catch somebody, you don't just leave it there. You want to have them. He did exactly what you love as a reporter. I called him and he absolutely doubled down on it, which was just hysterical. So I called him and I go, hey, I've got, the TV schedules here, and there wasn't any wrestling on. And he was like, son of a bitch, something's wrong. Wrestling was on. I read him the TV schedules of what was on, and there were only 2 channels in Birmingham at the time. It's just, you can't make this stuff up. This is why I love journalism, why I love nonfiction, is you just can't make it up. It's just classic,
Well, Jerry, I read, I agree with you. It was unbelievable how he doubled down, and all your characters. And this is going to sound terrible, but as I was reading about these people, I began to wonder, are they very stupid?
They really were pretty stupid. I mean, they're not the brightest folks. So this is not like a high-tech genius getting away with white-collar crime or something like that. Yeah.
Well, they couldn't have been all that stupid if they got away with it for all these years.
Yeah, they got away with it for decades. But, the system back then, especially, was racist, essentially. I mean, the justice system was racist. And so I don't know exactly the law in Alabama. I'm sure it was similar, but in Mississippi, and I'm sure it's almost identical in Alabama, but it was basically only white men could serve on juries, essentially. you know, the technically wasn't a law that said blacks couldn't serve on juries, but they never would they wouldn't let them get on the voting rolls. And if you weren't on the voting rolls, you aren't on the juries. And women weren't allowed to serve on juries in Mississippi. I thought this was so fascinating until 1968. It's like, really? They wouldn't let women, they would let women vote, but they couldn't serve on juries, you know. Anyway, it's just fascinating, which it helps to explain Emmett Till as well, which was an earlier case.
Well, I understand that in the Birmingham case, some of the perpetrators' ex-wives, or at least one of them, played a big role in giving you information. To what? And you said to me that you always interview ex-wives. They're really good. Why?
Yep.
What?
Well, you know,
what happened? Tell the story.
That's in, you know, you always want that. It's always ideal, you know, because anytime someone gets divorced, I'd say regardless of whether you're investigating Klansmen or not, or even a cold case, go get the divorce records. You know, you can always find out stuff in the divorce records. It's just always something that you'd be interested in most of the time. And a spouse, you know, ex-spouse is, you know, they're going to know the dirt on their ex. They just are. And a lot of times they're happy to share it. So I just figured, it was fascinating. Yeah, I found out she was testifying before the federal grand jury. And so I rushed over and talked to her, and just wild story, you know, wild story after wild story with her. Anyway, she tried to have him, you know, committed at some point to the insane asylum, as they called it back then. And it's just like, you can't make it up. It was so incredible.
Well, how do you top your early career? I mean, is life dull now?
Well, it's fascinating. Hang on a second. I don't know. I mean, you just keep going. You do what you do. We just did a project called Poverty in the Pandemic, and I'm very tickled with it. It's in fact, we just reported that the poor died. The rate at which they died was like twice as much, or for the wealthiest segment, which is really just 25,000 and up, died more than 3 times as often. Yeah, the poor died more than 3 times more than the richest in Mississippi. I mean, that's pretty staggering number. Pretty staggering difference. And you're talking about Mississippi, you're talking about, you know, New York State or something like that.
Well, it's probably true everywhere.
Yeah,
it may explain why some wealthy people could easily say there's no pandemic.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of foolish. Anybody who says there's no pandemic, it's pretty foolish.
Well, there are tens of thousands of Americans who were saying that and going to rallies and parties and motorcycle rallies and
Yep, exactly.
Yep. Well, what do you think when you spend so much of your work life looking at another decade, one that wasn't necessarily yours, but is more Anya's and mine? I'm a contemporary of Andy Goodman, and I certainly knew people who knew him.
Right.
And so these murders were very traumatic to, as Anya said, to people in our cohort, because we all felt we could have been them. And but to move out, what is the relevance of those past experiences to what we're experiencing and seeing now?
Well, in terms of what we're seeing right now,
what's
unfolding as we speak, I think we're seeing history repeat itself, is what I think.
What do you mean?
Well, we're, where we don't know our history, and therefore we are just absolutely repeating it from what we experienced during this time frame we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about the involvement of law enforcement in killing African Americans. We're talking about all these kind of things that were going on, and it's not the past at all. And so as long as we kind of keep repeating, history kind of goes in cycles anyway. It's not necessarily an exact circle, but I always think of it as more like concentric circles. And that's the way I feel about this. We're coming back on the same circle, and doing the same exact things in a way. So that's, we don't know our history. I mean, I can't tell you how many people who've read my book have said, I thought I knew this until I read your book. And I mean, white, black, whatever, people who've read the book. And I got an email the other day from a 66-year-old white woman in Georgia. And she said, I'm ashamed that I never knew this history.
Huh.
We don't teach this history. The civil rights movement is, basically that Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up, and Black Americans got their rights. Ta-da! That's kind of the narrative. So anyway.
We've got some interesting questions from
I was
students
just
in
going to
this.
say we've got some in the Q&A that
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Q&A.
So
Switching to my phone because I gotta run out the door, but I'm still talking to you, so hopefully it still works.
okay.
Oh, okay. So are we?
I'm hoping this will work for me. Yeah, it should work. It shows I'm on the phone here. Let's see.
Yeah, right down at the bottom right.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, you are.
All right.
Great.
Okay.
So the two Q&A questions, one of them
Yeah.
is the internet. How has that changed the investigative work that you're doing?
Brian's question, Brian Kennedy's question. We'll ask it when
I
Jerry
think
gets back.
he's muted.
Jerry. Hey, Jerry.
Unmute. Sorry about that. Hang on a
So
second.
one of the students in the class, Brian Kennedy, wanted to know how the internet has affected your investigative work.
Yeah,
I bet it's made it easier.
Oh yeah, it's made it a lot easier. I mean, made it a lot easier to find people and stuff like that. Although I have to say the elimination of the home phone has made it actually harder now sometimes to find people because they go through cell phones. Some people may have a home phone for, my mom and dad have the same home phone that they've had. They still haven't got rid of it for how many years? I guess 60 something years, so, or not quite 60, but anyway. Yeah, you can't get that anymore. So that makes it harder. But the internet in general makes it, much better, obviously.
Yeah. To Mike Effrey, who's a student in the class, wants to know, how do you go about interviewing somebody you know is a murderer? Do you remain polite, impersonal? What do you say to yourself?
Absolutely. Be polite and personal. Your job is to listen and take notes and record, and absolutely be as polite as you can, And so then why did you kill him? I mean, you'll be polite about it. You can ask, or you can ask it in a way that's not necessarily even accusatory at all. You said, well, I know you went on trial for that. What happened? And you can get them to talk about it. I mean, people love to tell their stories. So, yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Is this question from Alan? It says SEPA communication. Is that Alan? Yeah. She says that her father was born in Birmingham in 1945, and he tells stories similar to the ones you're telling. And she says that she thinks people think this happened a long time ago.
That's accurate. People say that.
Yeah. Is that why you do what you do? That's what Alan would like to know. She's Anya's assistant and
Yeah,
research.
I think it is when we do what we do. I mean, I think that's one of the things, trying to find So I'm changing this. I'm trying to change over here. Let's see if we can do this.
Well, no, there are two of you. That's great.
No, I know. I was trying to switch over to.
None of us are techno wizards.
I know. I'm trying to get my headphones to switch over. If I can get my headphones to switch over, I'll be fine.
John Hartman asks, what changes have you seen in the police in recent years?
Well, I think they've gotten more professional, but I'd also say the way that they handle a lot of situations has made it not ideal. You know what I mean? I mean, you saw Jacob Blake the other day get shot in the back 7 times when they could have tackled the guy. I mean, come on. I mean, I just don't understand that. I mean, it's frustrating. That's just frustrating. So I'm going to try one other thing. So
that's interesting. Charmaine, former student, a SEPA alumni, you sent me a question and I don't have it handy. Would you write it in, please? And we'll read it. It was a good question. If you were talking to a young person considering making investigative reporting their profession, what would you tell them?
Oh, I tell them, I think that you've just got to persist. I mean, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think that's one of the key things to do. Just be persistent.
Now I got it working. I don't know if you can hear me or not. I'm coming in on a different line now. Can you hear me?
Much clearer, much clearer.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now can you hear me? Okay. All right. Very good. I was trying to get to work. You can hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think that, go ahead.
Well, Anya can speak to this too. I mean, there's a real crisis within journalism, and it's a hard place to make a living. Can people do what you once did?
I think it's harder now, but I think if you get in the right place, you can do it. I think the thing people do is they figure I have to wait until they think they have to wait to do investigative reporting, if that makes any sense. Like people think, oh, I've got to wait till I have the position of an investigative reporter before I can be an investigative reporter. But that's not the case. You can do investigative reporting wherever you are. You have to wait. And then people say, well, they won't give me time to do investigative reporting. And then I give them the answer they don't like, which is do it on your own time.
Did you do it on your own time? Did you?
I did.
Tell us about that.
I did. Well, I mean, I was a court reporter. I mean, these cases were not, really technically part of my beat in a way, because it wasn't what I was technically covering, but I kind of worked them into my beat. You know what I mean? I just kind of went, yeah, I want to cover this. And of course, they involved courts, and eventually did go to court. So it fit. It's not like I could say to my editor, well, I can't do these stories today because I'm busy investigating the Medgar Evers case. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Now, when I got stories that deserved to be published, and they were happy to run the story. But you follow what I'm saying. At night, I was doing all this research and, calls and different things like that. That's what I was doing. So that's the way I handled it. Yeah.
So as someone we both know, Anne-Marie Cunningham asked, do you have, you know her. Do you have do you have any tips, she asks, for interviewing men who abuse their wives or girlfriends?
Yeah. Well, I think with anybody in that situation, they're a killer or they're an abuser, in a sense, you let them play that role. Like you don't try to make them something, they're not necessarily. I mean, I think that's the tendency. You can kind of let them spew their hatred, or in the case of, let's say, a wife abuser, they may start saying really negative things about their spouse or ex-spouse, or, they were nuts, or, what I mean? I think you just let people go. I think, you don't try to pull them back. like Beckwith would say these horrible racist things. And it's not like I'd pull them back and say, hey, wait a minute, that's pretty racist. You know, you let them kind of go with their own, you know, excesses or whatever. So, yeah.
Well, we talked about the cases you did solve. What are the cases that got away that you couldn't?
Oh, man, Emmett Till was the main one that just broke my heart. Yeah, I found, I mean, after Byron D. LeBecq got indicted for the murder of Medgar Evers, I actually worked some on the Emmett Till case. And
can I stop you just to fill in the pieces for the reader? The Emmett Till case is the case that launches the modern civil rights movement. A 14-year-old boy lynched, murdered, young man from Chicago goes to visit relatives in Mississippi and is accused of whistling at a white woman, and that's his death sentence. And the country was so incensed about this that much of the civil rights movement begins right there. Anyway, go Jerry.
In fact, real quickly on that same line is 4 days after Rosa Parks heard Dr. T.R.M. Howard talk about the Emmett Till case. He worked on the Emmett Till case with Medgar Evers. Rosa Parks boarded the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and refused to get up her seat. So there's a lot of interesting historical connections with that. But so I was talking to Emmett Till's mother, and she obviously wanted justice in her son's case. And again, somebody that's covered courts and stuff, I realized they've been acquitted for murder. So there was no way to try them again for murder. That would be barred by the Constitution, which bars double jeopardy. But they kidnapped him. And they admitted they kidnapped him. So I thought, well, you can just try him for kidnapping. And so I went and talked to a prosecutor who I knew was, very much an expert in the law. And he pulled down the old volume of what, the law was back in 1955, which I think was the 1942 code. And what he came back and said was, man, there's no way to do this. Kidnapping in 1955 had a 2-year statute of limitations. I'm like, you're kidding me. Kidnapping has a statute of limitations? I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. I was just heartbroken. Yeah.
But weren't there other things you could still get, like perjury?
Yeah, well, the perjury would have been, and I really didn't find out till later, perjury could have been against her. I think the easiest perjury case would have been against Carolyn Bryant, which would have been after the FBI.
The woman who was whistled at.
Correct.
Or alleged to have been whistled at.
And well, the unfortunate thing is we didn't know in 1955 what we know now, not that they would have prosecuted her, but she lied. When she got up and testified, she told a completely different story than she told originally told her own lawyers. We have the notes from what she told her lawyers originally, and then we know what she and the lawyers said out loud, and which was Emmett Till all but raped her. But in her original statement to attorneys, it was like Emmett Till grabbed her hand, asked her for a date. That was it. So that was her original statement. So obviously she was lying when she got up and testified. And it's a shame. And they should have tried her for perjury. They didn't do that. They tried to go for a manslaughter charge. The grand jury wouldn't go for that. So it's just, anyway, it's a tough case.
So Emmett Till is the case that got away. What else?
There's a bunch of others. So many cases, a lot of the cases in Mississippi that I wrote about, they pretty much got away with it. Almost every other case I wrote about, other than the ones I mentioned in the epilogue beyond the book. So there's 4 cases, main cases I worked on. There was also a 5th one, and there was conviction in that one. And then there was that's
the Vernon Dahmer case.
No,
that-
no, that one was in the book. This is one not in the book. This is the Henry Hezekiah Dean Charles Eddie Moore, and it was the guy who was involved with that was eventually prosecuted, and then trying to think, Winchester White case. There were just several other. There were a handful of others that were related that did get prosecuted. So, but most of these other ones did not. There were over 120 killings that we know of during the civil rights movement that were never prosecuted, punished, nothing. Yeah, killers got away with it.
So let's play this forward to now.
Sure.
Tell us about the Mississippi Center for Investigative Journalism.
Yeah, so we're dedicated to basically, exposing corruption, injustices, shining a light in the darkness, as we like to say, and that's kind of what we do in Mississippi. And so, like, poverty in the pandemic is a good example of that. We're just wrapping up a project we're doing on juvenile lifers, which is, basically about these juveniles that got sentenced to life without parole. And in fact, Mississippi continues to sentence juveniles to life without parole. Even after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled they ought to be rare, I think 2/3 of the juveniles that have been tried or for murder have been sentenced to life without parole. So it's continuing to happen. So that we're in the middle of a project on that. So anyway.
So before we close, one can't help but talk about the election. And
Sure.
One of the things we may have seen is what for so long was called the New South.
Yeah.
Are you feeling optimistic? Do you feel you helped build this thing? Is there more of a community?
I wouldn't give myself I don't know if I'd give myself much credit, but for that, there are a lot of people have been involved in that. I think you see Georgia obviously went for Biden and things like that would suggest some changes. I think changes will come over time, to the South. It's a good question to ask, although I'll have to say, and I know it's harder for people up north to understand it, but I do think there's a gap right now between, I guess what you'd say, what the average Southerner thinks compared to somebody who lives on one of the coasts, the way they kind of view the world and everything else. If you have like the average Mississippian or average Southerner, they just think of the world in a much different way than people from the coast, I'd say. Like their worldview or their national view is just different. And so we've got to learn. I think in general, it would be nice if we could be civil to one another for starters, because that's what that's the thing that has been unsettling in recent years is the rise in uncivility, or was it uncivility, incivility? Anyway, whatever the word would be. But people just being rude. And the other part is just kind of demonizing the language that we hear now, which is calling people or race of people monsters or murderers or rapists. That's a problem. That's a problem. And that helps to foster violence. Just look what happened up in Michigan where the governor almost got kidnapped. It was essentially because all this, hateful, almost, violent rhetoric, had, in my opinion, had inspired these, wackos to go do it. That's what happens. So if you keep spouting off like this, lock her up, or whatever the language is, they're going to feel like they're doing society a service, right? That's the troubling thing to me.
Anya, if you could, as they say on the radio, play us out, can you give us a summary of what you think the significance of Jerry's book and his work is.
Absolutely. So I think that Jerry is one of these classic impressive people that you're so modest about your achievements. And so it's so interesting because you're sort of laid back Southern politeness sort of belies your dogged, intrepid reporter persona. So there's a contrast there between the sort of hard-boiled work that you do and the very gritty, powerful work that you've done over decades to expose the structural racism and your kind of nice demeanor. So I can see how you got all those sick, racist, terrible people to speak to you. I think that, I'm sure you just lull them all into a sense of security. I think your book is long on detail and long on tradecraft. And I still, having read it, don't understand the terrible evil that these men were.
Yeah.
I think that was almost beyond your ken. You went after them, but you don't explain what motivated them. But I think they were cruel and obviously racist. And as you said, they didn't have to be smart. They got away with it because that was the society that they lived in.
And thanks to Jerry, they all died in jail.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. So you were doing God's work. And I really think that for anybody who's interested in this period, and in the role of journalism, that this is just a very important book and horribly depressing how much has changed, but also how little has changed. So those would be my final.
I write, and when I write inscribe to people, there are two things that I frequently inscribe. One is, I hope this book outrages you and inspires you. And then the other thing I write is, journalism matters, truth matters, justice matters. So.
That's right. Not letting these people get away with it. So thank you very much for
well, thank you guys for having me, and feel free to pass out my, contact information, and people, if they're interested in civil rights movement history, I post it every day on Facebook and Twitter. So they're welcome to follow me on that.
Well, thank you for your generosity. And Professor Dreifus, thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's really good to see.
Thank you for having me
here.
I appreciate
students and alumni.
All right.
Jerry, and thank you. You inspire us every day, and
thank you. Very kind of you.
So,
it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. And I wish this would say to the students one last thing is, I believe to this day, journalism is one of the world's most noble professions. So I hope that each of you will consider it seriously. It's a great profession.
Well, thank you, and good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good
Thanks,
night,
guys.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Would you like me to turn it off now?
Sure.
All right.
Oh, that was so
thank you,
interesting. We
Steve.
don't get to sit around and talk about how interesting that was.
We can do that. Yes.
Well, there's still
Would you like that to be on the recording, or would you like me to stop
No, I
recording?
think
turn off the recording.
You turn off the recording.
Thank you. God knows
Yeah.
if anyone listens.